Welcome to MaplewoodIan.com podcast. We have on the phone Tina Kelley. How are you doing, Tina?
Good. How are you?
Good. Tina has talked to us before. You are, of course, our local Maplewood author, journalist, mom, and excessive knitter. But that's another commentary. But, of course, you're also a poet, and we are here to talk about your third book of poetry, A Bloom and a Rye. You will be at Words Bookstore in Maplewood Village this Saturday, April 22nd at 7:30 to read and chat about this book. And we were talking before about kind of what's in this book. This isn't just sort of flowery poetry, although there's nothing wrong with flowery poetry. And this has some real beautiful writings in it, but also a lot of commentary about your life and work. And tell us sort of what makes up number 3 in the Tina Kelley poetry line.
Well, it's about how awe-inspiring the beauty of the world is, as well as how awe-inspiring the destruction and terrible news is as well. So both of those are the focus of the book, and both of those inspire great awe in me. It also builds on my work as a journalist. A lot of the reporting I've done throughout the years has inspired me poetically as well as journalistically. So many of the poems are informed by the reporting I've done for various newspapers and books.
Now, for those who don't know, but I think most people in Maplewood who know you and know your work, know you were at the New York Times for many years. You also were editor of their local website, The Local,
yes,
which was one of the first local web pages. We actually were friendly rivals for a while.
We were younger than you.
We were,
younger
yes.
than Maplewood Online,
but it was the New York Times going local online, which I think was a big breakthrough in journalism in this area in general.
Mm-hmm. And it was right when Patch was going, and
yes,
before Village Green.
It's one of the long line of online legacy news in town. But you were also at the Times writing in print for how many years were you at the Times?
I was there 10 years.
10 years, and before that you were in Seattle?
I was working at the papers there and freelancing, and I started out at the Philadelphia Inquirer in South Jersey.
Yes, and you're also, of course, married and the mother of 2.
Yes.
Young girl and young boy. And what got you into poetry, and how long have you been sort of playing around with words on the poetic level?
Well,
many years or kind of recent to time?
Oh, decades. My first poem was when I was 8. It got published in the school newspaper. It was about my goldfish. And it's been something I've done ever since. I never really stopped.
Just something to go along with your news interests?
It didn't originally, but once I was doing news full-time, I realized that there were a lot of crossover benefits between poetry and news gathering. Poetry teaches you how to write concisely and how to pick out the best telling details. Those skills are really useful in writing the news and writing nonfiction in general. So I was also, when you're writing general assignment news, you're meeting people that you wouldn't usually meet. You're going on reporting trips to places that you wouldn't usually go, and I wrote a lot about the Pine Barrens when I was first starting out. I wrote a lot about nature and about very interesting people and undervoiced populations, people whose stories don't get out as much as they should. All of that was very inspiring for poetry.
And what do you think this book gives that maybe most books of poetry don't? If someone says, I have a lot of poetry books, I like reading poetry, but what can I get out of this one that's different?
Well, I try to not be obscure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like reading obscure poetry. I don't like when a poet is acting like they have a private joke going on with themselves, and I'm excluded from it. So the poets that I admire tend to be ones that are accessible, and I think it's very user-friendly poetry that I try to write.
And you go to a lot of poetry events. I know we were in touch, and you're always talking about going to a judging or leading a poetry discussion or going to a poetry gathering. So it's something that's real. It's not just the writing that's important to you. It's also going out and seeing and sharing and discussing the art of the poetry.
Yes, and I'm in 3 local writers' workshop groups that are hugely important to me. That they form my regular deadlines for bringing new work, and they give me an extra set of eyes, very wise eyes, when I'm trying to see what works and what doesn't work in the particular poems I'm working on.
Now, one of the poems in the book, On Leaving the Newsroom, you said here you left the Times in 2009. And again, people will remember, you and I talked not too long after when your nonfiction book, Covenant House book, Almost Home, Helping Kids Move from Homelessness to Hope, came out. What's this poem about in terms of discussing leaving the newsroom?
Well, I was leaving for good, and I wanted to write about, what the whole experience of writing for the New York Times had meant for me and what it was like. And I read it at my going-away party, and they published it on the local blog. And I read it last month at an event that introduced A Bloom and a Rye at the Bernardsville Public Library, and I was very moved by the nobility of the news-gathering profession, especially in these political times, that so much care and work goes into writing newspapers, and they're deeply disparaged in many cases nowadays, and I find that very worrisome.
And why is that? I think I agree with you.
I think you probably do. Truth is what's needed to manage a society, and if people stop valuing truth, then what's the basis that we have to go forward with? If people are going to believe fake news, then a great deal is lost and endangers the republic.
Can we get a taste of that one?
Sure. I'll read the whole thing because it's short. On leaving the newsroom. It is magic writing news. We have an honored front row seat in life, the chance to walk through the bat cave for 6 hours, seeing the last ceilings full of brown bats mysteriously dying. What a privilege to listen to someone tell of brain injury, grief, monster trucks, or false imprisonment. A gift to read the actual suicide note, hear about a beau who's the cowboy kind of quiet. Watch the drips fall off Michael Phelps' perfect shoulders. Hear good luck from the flood victims who need it more than we do. Attend a nocturnal bird migration concert. Know a little bit about just about everything. Start with rumors and end with reality. Swear by precision. Become incapable of fibbing. Ask with abandon, and take notes on talkers more profound than any of our imaginations. Then distill, discuss, dither over it, and hit send, so 1,000,000 can know what we learned. Here I heard Muhammad Atta's eyes looked so dark no one could see his pupils. Here I learned of the girl who would not take off her father's necktie because it smelled like him before he rushed into the burning tower. You can't buy a front row seat like that, a priceless seat, rarer and rarer. And for 20 years they paid me to sit or stand or run or sprint and use that keyboard. So few are this lucky.
That's great. And
Thanks.
I think
Thanks.
that you have a very descriptive style, something I always admire in good writing, because I think it's very difficult, especially as a reporter, to sort of take in all the signals and all the images, whether by word or by viewing. And I think that's a good reminder to people what the work we do. You also mentioned in there 9/11, which I know you were part of the New York Times Pulitzer-winning coverage that day and also afterward. The Portraits in Grief, and something that I think it turns it into sort of a nonfiction writing. A lot of your poems write about real things. So, like you said, you're not just writing the sort of ideas of fiction or making things up. It's
Right.
a bit of journalism in your poetry.
Yes.
Is that important to you?
Yeah, I keep notes I keep a journal, and when there's something that I run across that I think I'll put in a poem someday, I put it over in a special file, and that's what I use as my raw materials for when I'm sitting down to write. So I sort of gather, my daughter calls me a magpie. I gather shiny bits and put them all in one place to play with later. So there's a lot of chunks of truth in there. I could never make this stuff up.
And you also have some poetry that involves your children. Your daughter is now 15 or 16?
16, yep.
And your son 12 or 13?
12.
So what are the poems you wrote one about the last Christmas? My daughter won't know about sex. That's far from flowers and roses and pretty images. What is that a poem about, and what brought that about?
Well, that was when she was 9 or 10, and I had a great deal of sense of protectiveness about her, around her, and wondering what it was going to be like for her when she went into romantic relationships. She was deeply into gymnastics back then and was doing round-offs in the house all the time. And I sort of put all that together and mused about it, and she's forgiven me for writing it.
And is it difficult sometimes when you try to take your own personal experiences that involve your family, your children, or husband, or anyone else, and put that into a poem, or is it just sort of a natural thing they have come to realize that's going to happen?
Well, I don't do it in a way that would make them upset or would make them look bad. My son knows when he's being poetic, and he knows that I steal stuff from him, so he'll say something, and he'll say, well, write that down. Write that down.
Oh.
Yeah. So.
Do either of them have the poetry bug yet, or the news bug?
She won a poetry Grammy in middle school, and he's in 7th grade now, coming up to that. I find them both very amazingly good at putting words together, and it's inspiring to me, and I do steal from them on occasion, and they are okay with that.
And now, the poem you read, a lot of people think of poems as having rhymes every other time, and is that something you do, or you purposely do not, or it's just whatever feels? If something feels like it should rhyme, we'll go with it. If not, we want to tell it in sort of a descriptive, other type of non-rhyming approach. It's
mostly free verse. I do the occasional formal poem. If there's a contest looking for a formal poem, I'll give a shot at it. I like the 14-line poem, but mine aren't sonnets in that they are not metered or rhyming, but I do try to get music in there quite a bit.
That free verse, is that more difficult to write, or is it just a different kind of challenge?
It's different. It's different. If you're doing formal poetry, you get a little bit of slack cut for doing the harder play that's required. Like I did a very fancy form a couple weeks ago that could only have 2 different sounds as the end lines in a 25-line poem, and it was very, very complicated. But it's easier, I think, to do free verse. You just have to make it even better because you're not following any rules, so it has to very much stand alone, each line as well written and well crafted.
And again, we're talking to Tina Kelley, author of A Bloom and a Rye. She'll be at Words Bookstore in Maplewood Village this Saturday, 7:30 p.m. A Bloom and a Rye is also a title of one of the poems, right?
Yes.
And what is that poem about?
Well, that is about how things can be absolutely gorgeous and absolutely discombobulated and still be worthy of awe. It won the 2014 New Jersey Poet Prize through the Journal of New Jersey Poets, and it's one of my favorites. It formed the core to the book, the thematic core to the book.
And how many poems are in this one?
Oh, about 50.
And how did you choose? I assume you have endless poems written down and in your head and all over the house and all over the computer.
None of them are in my head. They're all written down.
Yeah, sort of everywhere. How do you decide what to put in a book each time?
It's very hard. I had wonderful help this time from Baron Wormser, who's a great poet who works with Cavan Carey Press. And I had put them I send them out to be published by magazines, and the ones that get published tend to have a higher chance of getting in a book because they've been validated externally. So I'll collect all the ones that have been published recently in a file and see if they play off each other and see if they have any thematic core or any order that they call out to. But with this book, I had sent it out and it had gotten accepted by Cavan Carey Press, which I'd always wanted to be in. And it was sent over to Barron for editing, and he was open to newer poems, ones that I had written since I'd submitted it to the press. And so I sent him 10 or 15 of ones that I'd written in the meantime. And we figured out ones that were strong enough to go in, got rid of some that were weaker or that got on my nerves over time, and he suggested 3 different orders that they could go in, and we decided on one. But it was amazing to have that amount of help from another poet, and I really like what he did with the ordering of them.
And now, how do you go about when you come up with ideas? I know if I come up with story ideas for news, I have certain files in my computer I just put them in there and keep them there. And I know comedians always talk about, I think Jerry Seinfeld always said, he gets a joke idea, he has to write it down somewhere, he carries something around. Are you getting ideas all the time, or do you have a way that you just sit and sort of have to write and come up with them in that way? How do the ideas flow?
Oh, they just come randomly, and I write them down wherever I am. I usually, in my phone, I have a little note file. Or if my phone's far away, there's a couple notebooks handy. I'm pretty much always on my laptop. So there's definitely, it goes in the journal and then it goes in the file for poetry someday. If I were to look at a blank piece of paper and be told to write a poem, I would probably choke.
Yeah.
If I can look at my raw materials, they're sort of like my...
So it's sort of a collective process?
Yeah,
depending on when the ideas fall. Are you ever wake up in the middle of the night and have to write it down, or in the dentist chair and wait a minute, I have an idea, or do they kind of come everywhere, or just sort of at quiet moments?
In the shower, in the middle of the night, when I'm on a walk, if I mishear a song lyric, that happens a lot. Spam subject lines from email,
that could be a whole poem in itself.
Yeah, I've done a couple of those. So, they come from anywhere.
Now, do you think poetry is on the right? Is the internet and self-publishing, although you're not self-publishing, but there are a lot more ways for people to get their poetry out. Is poetry on a rise, or where do you think it is in sort of the general interest of? It seems like there's a lot of poetry out there. Is it more than usual, or is it sort of?
I think it is.
Not?
I was doing an interview with David Wagner, who's a great American poet. I was interviewing with Patty Ann Rogers a couple of weeks ago. That hasn't been published yet, but we're working on it. And I asked him if he was ever bothered that poetry was sort of a junior varsity art form in some ways. It doesn't get the headliners that popular music or fiction does, and doesn't attract the crowds. And he said, there are about 2,000 more poetry outlets now through the internet than there were several years ago, and there's a very lively market. It gets out there and it gets read, and there are some breakout poets, and the poetry slam movement has been helpful, and it doesn't really matter. It's for me, I don't have a choice. If I'm working through a drama in my life, it tends to come out in a poem, and not necessarily a publishable poem, but a poem. And it's how I'm wired. So I wish I wrote novels that could make me millions of dollars, but poetry has been what I do.
Excellent. Have you ever written anything about Maplewood or living in Maplewood, or has Maplewood been any kind of spark of an idea?
I did one on Hurricane Sandy. That was
that hit our town.
Yeah, it was called On Being One of the 25% of people in Maplewood who's retained electrical power.
Oh, you were the one.
Yeah, And we had people, everyone was plugging in their phones at our house. We had 13 people sleeping here.
Oh my gosh.
We had, I think American Banker was put out from our dining room for a couple days.
Oh, very fun.
Our friend was here. We had trees lying on our power line, but they didn't take out the internet. They took out cable TV, and we had relatives who'd had a house full of house guests when their house in Glen Ridge got just slammed by a tree. So they were all here. My elderly mother and her home health aide were here. It was crazy. So I got a poem out of that, out of what it's like to be a hostess.
And last thing else is, who are some of your influences, either historic poems or poets, or today, people who still write today?
I adore the poetry of Patty Ann Rogers, and I just finished reading a biography of Rumi, the Sufi poet. He's a great influence. Walt Whitman, David Wagner, Bob Hickok, Dean Nurksey, a bunch of. I love Billy Collins. I love Elise Partridge, who just came out with a posthumous book that's I'm looking forward to reading, and Susan Blackwell Ramsey. I just I don't read as much as I should, but I have my deep favorites.
And the great thing about poetry is you don't have to read a lot to read a lot.
You can just dip in,
grab a few, and go through them, and that's it. It's not
and I get
opus.
A bunch in the mail in email every day. So there's a lot of ways to get it, particularly in the internet.
Excellent. Okay, we'll be talking to Tinakelley, author of A Bloom and a Rye. We will see her on Saturday night at Maplewood Village's Words Bookstore at 7:30, where she'll be reading and signing and chatting poetry. Is there another book on the horizon anytime soon?
Don't know. We're working on. I would say it's about in its 4th month of gestation. If it were human, the pieces are there, but it's not viable yet.
Still cooking.
In terms of a poetry collection, and I'm always working on nonfiction projects as well.
Great. Well, thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you.